Hello, everyone. This is Comrade Panther back after a very long hiatus. We have Comrade Carlo, Comrade Fish, and Comrade Iotor. And tonight we are going to be discussing the position of the Lumpen proletariat in the revolutionary movement. So, first off, what is the lumpen proletariat? It's a word, a category that's bandied about in a variety of left spaces on the internet and off the internet. Some people think that the lumpen proletariat is the key to revolution. Some people think that the lumpen proletariat are absolutely horrible and should all be rounded up and shot. But being good dialectical materialists, we realize that the answer is most likely somewhere in between. Yotor, go ahead.
The lumpen proletariat is the group of people who are pretty consistently unemployed. They might have like sometimes an odd job, or often like have to do some type of criminal activity as well, but not like they aren't like they're not inside of the means of production.
Yeah, if you read Sakai's book, the Dangerous Class, and it's actually like a double-sided book, Mao Zedong's Revolutionary Laboratory and the Dangerous Class. He his argument is that the lumpen is a fluid class, right? Like you could be proletarian at one point and then lumpen at another, or you could be simultaneously both. The example that I like to use is the individual who works at McDonald's and slangs a little bit on the side, right? So making money to support yourself in modern day America, it's a motherfucker, isn't it? Like it's hard. And we cannot be naive enough to believe in the myth of the old proletarian who works at the factory and goes home and I don't know, reads all volumes of Capital or something like that, right? Shit doesn't work like that anymore. As a matter of fact, shit never worked like that, right? Classes have always been fluid. And as Maoists, we realize the importance of class stand. There's class position, which is essentially how you make your money. Broadly speaking, you're either bourgeois, meaning you make your money how? Through the exploitation of others and control of capital, control of the means of production. And proletarian, which is you support yourself through the sale of your labor, right? The definition of a proletarian is one who has nothing but their chains to lose and one who has nothing to sell but their labor. So how can we define labor? Because if you go in cursed left book, left Twitter, left Tumblr, please stay off Tumblr, spaces, you see people broadening the category of proletarian to all sorts of things. And of course, there's going to be pushback from the more orthodox Marxist types. But from the perspective of organizing, because we're really not interested in endless and ceaseless debates, and we're certainly not interested in driving people away from the revolutionary movement. So how should we as Marxist, Leninist, Maoist organizers, as communists, relate to people such as sex workers and others who engage in those types of activities? Carlo?
Yeah, I want to go ahead and say that the sex trade has been a hot topic, and for good reason. A lot of proletarian feminist thinkers are coming out and talking about it, because it's requires a lot of nuance. There are sex buyers and there's sex sellers in the trade, and it gets even more complicated when you consider that relative to the world, most people involved in the sex trade are not willing, voluntary workers. They are enslaved to this trade by their pimps or by a corporation or something to that effect. How we relate to them, I think drawing a clear line of who are the exploited in the trade, who are those who are victims of this trade and have nothing to lose from revolution. I think that's a good starting point.
Yeah, I agree. And I'd hate to call myself a revolutionary historian. I mean, I do have sort of semi-professional historian training from university, but I'm more of a history nerd. So going back to the history of revolutionary movements, um, we see that sex workers and other semi-proletarian, semi-lumpen people have played a pretty major role in armed struggles and in other aspects of the revolution. I'd probably say that the most important role was played during the American War, which is what the Vietnamese call the Vietnam War, the Indo-Chinese Wars, where the Viet Minh and the National Liberation Front, known to Americans as the Viet Cong, which is actually a slur, but the National Liberation Front and the earlier Viet Minh would actually recruit sex workers who had national consciousness, and they would be ordered or they would voluntarily entrap American and French and Japanese officers and either milk them for information or just off them, kill them. So, and Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party also recruited. In China, they're referred to as floating people, actors, sex workers. Basically, in feudal Chinese society, these people were considered the lowest people on the in the pecking order, musicians, etc. And the thing is that they have skills in evading the police, in evading enemy forces, etc. When Mao was at Jianghangshan, I'm pretty sure I butchered that pronunciation, but when he was in the mountains, he ran across a bunch of bandits, and he recruited them into the Red Army. And one of the greatest Chinese generals of this period that served the Communist Party, General He Long, was a former bandit. And there's a story. If you read Edgar Snow's Red Star Over China, this dude literally he had a kitchen knife and he started killing Kuomintang officials, and he ended up with rifles and a pretty substantial group of bandits that was recruited into the Communist Party. So in terms of our recruitment, we should keep those examples in mind before we just write people off. That's how I've always thought about it. Iotor.
I mean that, and also like in the masterwork that I co-founded, a couple of our like founding members either were former sex workers or were at the time, and that's kind of like, that's sort of like the thing that radicalized them, was what it's like living through that type of stuff. So I would almost argue it's not just like, yeah, we can reach out to these people too, which I'm not saying that's what you're saying. It's just, I think that's a way that people often frame it. It's like, this is a group of people who like highly prone to be radicalized. And it's anybody who's at like the bottom of like boot of the social hierarchy is the people who are the most likely. So I think that like sex workers and anybody in these, like any type of like floating people who are in like an impoverished setting, I think are really easily radicalizable.
Yeah, I agree. So going back to the United States, bringing our analysis home, probably the most important theoretician on the lumpen proletariat in the United States was before Sakai. We had Huey P. Newton, who actually influenced Sakai's thought quite a bit. And Huey developed what we know as intercommunalist theory. And I personally have quite a few issues with it, specifically with the idea that nations are obsolete, which I find to be a bit of anarchist idealism on Huey's part. The thing with the Black Panther Party is that every ideology, every trend wants to claim them for their own. For example, Trots, I like to bring up how George Jackson mentioned how he met Trotsky in prison. MLs refer to some of Fred Hampton's speeches. Okay, the Black Panther Party was really none of these things. It was a very, very eclectic formation. They drew influence from everywhere. For example, Fred Hampton gave a speech in which he said that Kim Il Sung was the greatest revolutionary in the history of the world. He basically put Kim Il Sung above Mao Zedong, which is Maoists we find heretical. But yeah, I mean, Eldridge Cleaver and his visit to North Korea gave the Black Panther Party a bit of a juche strain. But Huey talks about how the lumpen are forming a new revolutionary class as the deproletarianization of major cities beginning in the late 60s with the triumph of neoliberalism and the subsequent closing down of factories in places like Detroit, Cleveland, Gary, Indiana, etc., and in our own hometown of St. Louis, which had provided employment, not necessarily good employment, but fairly decent employment at fairly decent wages that supported the creation of a Black middle class even. These jobs started to go away. So Huey mentioned in a speech that he gave, I believe in 1971, that this this would lead to the lumpenization of substantial chunks of the Black working class. And Huey, as we know, was a student of Frantz Fanon, who, writing from a third world perspective, saw the lumpen proletariat or broken proletariat. That's literally what lumpen proletariat means in German. Both Huey and Fanon saw these people forming an important class that must be won away from being bought off by the colonial ruling class. So what do we think of that? Comrade Iotor.
So, I mean, I think it's like almost objectively correct that the lumpen proletariat emerged as one of the biggest classes in America after Huey P. Newton's like life and death, or after his death and like throughout his life. But it's like the degree of automation that we have and the degree to which Chinese revisionism has caused American production to be like rapidly exported out into China, and with the basically now we like mostly are in the age of information. So the two classes, the age of information in the sense that like it's having a technical or intellectual skill that is like getting people jobs within America. I believe that fairly soon it's going to be about 70% of jobs in America will require higher education. So the two like classes that are emerging are like college students who aren't currently employed, and you can kind of organize in a similar, or a lot of them aren't, you can kind of organize in a similar way with lumpen people, and the lumpen proletariat, because there's not like like the trend is there that it's that, and it's like the expansion of the lumpen proletariat. But I think Huey P. Newton was really right about like the importance of the lumpen proletariat. I think that's like one of the main things that really defined what made the Black Panthers so effective. I mean, even Eldridge Cleaver in the ideology of the Black Panther Party like states that like one of the central deviations from the ideology of the Black Panther Party and that of like other communists before them was like the central place that the unemployed held within it, and that being because of Fanon and because of the place of Black Americans. And sorry, but I think if you read in his document on intercommunalism, which was recently assembled, I think it's on page 24. He talks about like trying to sort of not necessarily, he doesn't like explicitly say proletarianize, but like the schools for Black youth that are sort of trying to get people or like trying to get them into a more like proletarian discipline. I think the scholar who assembled his thesis, his name, it's Delilo something. Delilo Vasquez, Vasquez. I think I'm pronouncing that poorly because I'm a Midwesterner. But fuck, where was I? Yeah. So those schools, like they had a lot of issues just trying to like kind of push that education onto it. I think Kawasi Balagoon's ideas with the like worker, with like trying to help co-ops and stuff like that, and trying to start like trying to start co-ops to sort of like employ unemployed people through like the production of vegetables and like vacant lots and everything, and and then like to sell that in the sort of that instead of the survival programs that were so reliant on like donations from the Black bourgeoisie that kind of led it into a more formist line in the end. I think that that trying to make like I think the idea of a worker co-op like being like started by revolutionaries in order to like sort of proletarianize lumpen proletariat is a very productive way to get people together, organized, alive, and then against the system above them. And but I could be very.
All right, I saw Fish's hand, then Carlo gets to weigh in. Fish, the floor, or rather the microphone is yours.
The sea floor. Yeah, what I kind of wanted to point out, so we were talking about like what classes are rising in the United States, and I definitely do agree that like the lumpen proletariat is a growing class. Deindustrialization really affected the American working class, and then you have the whole colonialism, national oppression, legitimate work is a lot harder to come by for nationally oppressed people, and so they're forced into other avenues to survive. But what I wanted to point out is another class that I haven't seen, or I didn't hear anyone mention it yet, is the semi-proletariat. Specifically thinking like gig economy workers, temp workers, people who work odd jobs. I think that more and more the proletariat, the industrial proletariat, as we think of it, is kind of being broken up and sort of stripped of a lot of the rights and protections that were established, through hundreds of years of revolutionary struggle, or of worker struggle, rather. And so we're seeing workers who work multiple jobs, who don't have a stable schedule, who have to switch jobs every few months. So I think that in a lot of ways the proletariat is sort of being atomized and converted into either the lumpen proletariat or the semi-proletariat, or both. There's a lot more blurring of the lines between classes. So someone can be a proletariat for a few months and then lose their job and find temporary work and be a semi-proletariat and then have to do some hustling on the side. Like I think the round conclusion that we can come to, though, is that the classical Marxist proletariat, like we think of it, is more in decline, and we have to kind of think of new ways to think of the working classes and how to work with them.
I think that's a great point, Fish. That yeah, it's important we draw attention to that. And a lot of these semi-proletariat people, that's the kind of person that Panther was talking about. They're working a McDonald's job for a few months, slinging on the side. They can't handle some life event that comes up, and they have to ditch the job and be mobile, be flexible, because our lives are unstable. But I wanted to speak on two things that Iotor said that I feel like it's important we discuss. One being the globalization of labor. I don't think that that was a result of like Chinese revisionism. I think that was purely a result of U.S. imperialism and its desire to create a mobile, liquid workforce that it can quickly subvert labor laws in when they spring up. A lot of people, as a union organizer, tell me that if we get a union, our contract will disappear, and it's a real fear. When Detroit was getting their unions and their labor power was rising, what did the big corporations do? They went to Mexico. In the same time frame, they decided that they were going to really push and endorse a global agreement on trade, which included like NAFTA, right? Those things were anti-worker bills that they put through. The other thing that I wanted to talk about and push back on, I'll save because I don't want to waste our time too much of it. We got a lot of questions.
I'd just like to clarify really quickly. I wasn't necessarily making the argument that like the cause of the deindustrialization of America was Chinese revisionism. I was just sort of connecting that because I'm on a Maoist podcast. It definitely is that it was the U.S. trying to like doing that everywhere, and they took advantage of it there. But I think it's also really important to mention that whenever we're talking about Huey P. Newton's theory of intercommunalism specifically, because the idea behind it is kind of that the economic connectedness of different like communities throughout the world makes it so that it's like socialism in one country is like really difficult to achieve, and that's the importance of having a revolutionary power from within the imperial core being being the Black colony in America, because the idea behind it is that he was trying to synthesize revolutionary intercommunalism to communicate to like Black revolutionaries that the Vietnamese struggle was like central to the Black struggle in the united defense from the American government. And I think the fact that in the end, like obviously like the amount of internal pressure within America and the amount of like fragging and stuff done by Black nationalists in Vietnam is like was a major component in causing Vietnam to like defeat America. But I also think the fact that there wasn't ever like a successful revolution inside of America is the reason why countries like Vietnam and China like is a major reason why they have like sort of subdued to revisionism, because the economic control and embargoes and everything of places like America, because we still like because American government and NATO and everything still like controls the economic sphere so well, it can kind of push revisionism. And that's like, I think that's a major part of the importance of why the struggle here is so important within the intercommunalist framework, is that until we like defeat it here, the struggle is immensely more difficult. Not saying impossible, but immensely more difficult for our comrades in places like China and Vietnam and everywhere else that have been pushed to like economic reforms.
All right, very good discussion. Carlo says that internal contradictions versus external. As Maoists, we know that internal contradictions are more important. For example, houses are best undermined from inside. You could tear a house down from the inside with the sledgehammer. You can't tear a house down, a brick house at least, from the outside with the sledgehammer. You're just going to break your sledgehammer and you're going to hurt yourself. An egg is an egg. An egg will never turn into a rock because their internal components, their internal makeup is different.
But it also is a lot more likely to turn into a chicken if there's not an external component like hammering on it, you know? It's like, obviously the internal contradiction is the central one that this internal contradiction is where the potential for communist revolution comes from, but the external contradictions are like still a very irrelevant factor. They're not the decisive factor. It's still possible to have a successful revolution outside in the world, even while America is still occupies the world, but it's made immensely more difficult by the like U.S. embargoes and everything.
Difficult, but not impossible. All right, so moving on to our next point of discussion. You've kind of already talked about this, but the conditions and class breakdown of American society in the year 2022. Like, when we talk about class, I know I already said earlier that it's a broad view to look at it in terms of bourgeoisie and proletariat, but that's really not the best way to break down class in the United States because it obscures a lot of things, right? So, which class can we say is the most numerous, and how are classes like fluid? Like, how do people transition between classes, and what does lumpenization mean to us in the year 2022, especially in light of the recent uprisings against the police? Like, what was the class character of the uprisings against the police that have rocked the country over the past 10 years, especially in our hometown? And well, it's not Carlo's hometown. It's not Fish's hometown either. But in our city, St. Louis, and in Minneapolis a couple years ago. So let's talk class a little bit. Carlo.
Yeah, this is possibly one of the more important discussions that often gets glossed over. We're working with an incorrect class map, as Comrade Val Travesty wrote in an article earlier this year. We American Maoists are working off this map that was kind of handed down from the old left, and we need to re-examine that. We need to understand the class characteristics of gender and race, because who is really the proletariat in this country, and who is really actually, a petty bourgeois kind of machination. That's what Sakai is proposing, is that the settler nation, by and large, does not constitute a proletariat in this country. Settler men, by and large, are petty bourgeois. But where it makes a connection to this argument, this discussion today, is that very quickly you can slide from petty bourgeois to lumpen. Very quickly, the bourgeoisie can utilize your disadvantage to their advantage. They use the settler men in history as a military force of colonization, specifically instances of, Sakai mentions in Settlers when the Chinese boating industry, or excuse me, fishing industry in California was set up. The settlers come in, they look around, they see all this stuff set up, and with a state sanction, they take it by force. They were kind of deputized in that. They face no repercussions, and they benefit from it today. And that wasn't that long ago. When the Anglos got there, it was 1840s, I want to say. So this is recent history. This is within America's recent past. Those are things that I think need to be brought to the forefront in the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Carlo. Especially in when we're talking about history. For example, the so-called Queen of the United Kingdom just passed away the other day. I don't know why people are acting so shocked and surprised at her and hurt at the death of a 96-year-old woman. But yeah, people are like, oh, colonialism, that was so long ago. Imperialism, that was so long ago. And yet you can literally find pictures of this individual, Elizabeth Windsor, being carried by dark-skinned people. So it's not ancient history. Ancient history, you're going back to like the King Xerxes in Persia, or Alexander the Great. That's ancient history. And even shit that they did has an impact on us. So, like, that's the thing. When stuff happens, when horrible things happen, when entire nations are dispossessed and driven off their land or brought to serve another caste of people as the proletariat in a certain country, yeah, that shit has echoes throughout history. Carla would like to mention that there is no black bourgeois class in the United States. I think Beyonce and Jay-Z would beg to differ, but go ahead.
Well, the point I'm trying to make is that the Black nation has been dispossessed, exactly like you were saying. They don't constitute a bourgeois class for their own nation. They don't, Jay-Z doesn't own factories where Black proletarians work. Beyonce, Oprah, they're not overseeing, large tracts of land where New Africans live. Oprah comes and exploits Northern California towns, and let me tell you, there are very, very few Black people in Northern California. She comes up there and she steals water from the local population. She exploits the local Hispanic and poor white people up there. She doesn't go down to to New Africa, to Mississippi. She's definitely bourgeois in character. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that as a class, they don't constitute.
So what you're saying is that it's possible because since we now live in this beautiful, multiracial, multinational melting pot of imperialism, it's possible for individual Black people to join the ranks of the multiracial, multinational bourgeoisie. But as a class in and of itself, there is no new African national bourgeoisie. Most Black people in the United States still work for white-owned companies and stuff like that. That's what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I think that when we look at the bourgeoisie in general, like the billionaire map, very, very few Black people are represented of any gender. And they're often tokenized. Like I think Malcolm talked about how they're going to give you a Secretary of State. They're going to give you different figureheads, and that's what I think that these people represent.
Totally agree with everything everybody's been saying. Just because I happen to have like an academic preference for Huey P. Newton, I happen to have like the things where he says that here. He says, I do not recognize the Black bourgeoisie as different from any other exploited people. They are living in a fantasy world, and the main thing is to instill consciousness, to point out their real interests, their objectives, and their true interests, just as our white progressive and radical friends have to do in the white community. That's page 24 of the intercommunal document. And then whenever he's talking about the CalPEC, which was it was like it was like a union syndicate of black liquor store owners. They had like issues getting them to like in a war against the Panthers. Newton talks about whenever Calpec requested the Panthers organize a boycott around a racist liquor store, and in return Calpec was supposed to give money or like the liquor stores in Calpec were supposed to give money for survival programs once a month, and they had to like haggle them for it. And so I think it's definitely the case that that like there is not, like, I don't think there is such thing as a black bourgeoisie, but I think it can be really difficult. Like in the past, I think it would be a lot. I think in the past it was more difficult to like get people who are black and like towards the bourgeoisie end of the economic spectrum to realize their actual interests. But I think that like this was all whenever they were having these issues with the news, there was sort of like black people's quality of life was like improving through reformist means to the point where it seemed hopeful. But I think now like it's pretty clear that things are heading in a far more fascistic route. I've talked to people who are like indigenous and Syrian who like own like businesses, and like they honestly, like talking to them, like they're sympathetic to a lot of the like ideas in intercommunalism, because they kind of realize that everything that they've built can sort of be like wiped out from under them. I think in I forget which I think it's the second to last of the historic 8 documents by that Indian Naxalite Maoist whose name I forgot. It's like we must carry forward the peasant revolution by combating revisionism or something. It makes a really good point that you have to have the poorest peasants in charge of the peasants reformers, like land reform movement, because if it's the richer ones, they'll kind of get complacent and the whole thing will sort of collapse. So I think it's important that that like the black bourgeoisie be like incorporated into these movements. But at the end of the day, I think it's also important that the more like economically destitute portion of the black population really like sort of holds up the ideological and organizing vanguard.
All right, what's up next? Like, what other key things are important for us to discuss in a conversation about the revolutionary potential of the lumpen in the United States?
Well, I would want to bring up how the lumpen have a tendency to vacillate between proletarian and bourgeois ideology. And so that's one of the things that makes it really tricky to organize the lumpen, because on the one hand, you know, in a given moment, they can be organized around a revolutionary program. You know, they all know fuck the police. You know, they know the system is all fucked up. They know this, that the power structure is bullshit. But at the same time, like in a lot of cases, all they're really trying to get is a little bit of money or a little bit of power for themselves. And so in that way, you know, not only can they be bought off, but, you know, given a little bit of power, it's really easy to see them sort of just using it to reestablish the same kind of exploitative patterns that caused this mess in the first place. So I think it's important to emphasize that in any instance where you are organizing the lumpen, it's important to have like an organization that is capable of sort of maintaining a correct revolutionary orientation. I think proletarian leadership is going to be very important there. Leadership from people who not only have nothing to lose, but are, you know, daily exploited as well, who are part of the cycle of capital and have kind of an intuitive understanding of how capitalism exploits people, as opposed to lumpen people who are mostly outside of that cycle. for better or for worse.
I think that's a really good point. I think one of the like most important questions we have when organizing with the lumpen proletariat is quite literally how do you organize with the lumpen proletariat? The most traditional form of like organizing model that's happened in the countries that aren't under feudalism or imperialism, that are like within the imperial core, have been stuff like labor unions that are specifically like organized around labor itself. And I think it requires a lot more sort of creativity to organize in our conditions now that so many people aren't in any way associated with the labor union or associated with the means of production. Which I have a couple of like things that we've been doing in the mass org, like various degrees of success, but I'm also kind of curious if anybody has any specific stuff that they're thinking or doing.
FTP Baltimore had some work with the Lumpen and wrote a summation on their errors. I think that is an important article you can find on PVN. There's been a few things written on PVN about the Lumpen. Ultimately, I don't think it can be done without a organization that is militarized. I think that a communist organization without the discipline for basically military action can't reach on a large scale the lumpen proletariat, because who are we organizing against with the lumpen proletariat? We're organizing against the lumpen bourgeoisie, and those motherfuckers do not play. They will fuck your ass up, to be curt.
I definitely like wholeheartedly agree with that. I mean, it's just objectively the case that a militarized communist organization is the only thing that is going to pull us through this. I guess the question that I more have is how to get people off the street and into that. You need, I think, at least from like my knowledge of it, you generally need to start off with more like mass organizations. In the Philippines, there's the more like Maoist militant organization, and then you have more like unions and stuff throughout the towns, if I'm not mistaken. And you have the Soviets in Russia. In China, because there was actively a war, the protracted People's War strategy was the Long March, an effective strategy. But right now, you can't, like, the first thing a person does as a revolutionary right now can't be something through like military action, in my opinion, because there needs to be like larger amounts of people in order to do anything successful with that. It needs to start off in like the mass organization. It needs to start off with like the fronts community organizing to like get people organized and in that to have the mass support. And like, I guess what I was thinking, programs that we've had that have had decent success organizing lumpen proletarian people. When we first started off, we did like mutual aid stuff with homeless people, and got some members out of that. But that has the really large issue that you need to have like funding for that, which because we don't, the Panthers had a black bourgeoisie. We don't have any access to anything like that, so that has a lot of problems. We've been doing a lot of like defense from patriarchy type stuff, mixing teaching like women's or like self-defense for anybody, and then having like radical feminist theory with it. And right now we're also like working on a tenants union with a lot of people who like are probably unemployed there. But I was sort of curious if anybody has any particularly effective methods of getting people off the street and organized in the transition between getting people off the street and like armed militants.
I think if you ask that question, you're not seeing the forest for the trees. You are dead set on a question that you cannot answer at this moment. And what I'm trying to tell you is that this militarized communist organization is the first step, then that means that we can't begin with the lumpen. I don't know what your class background is, Iotor, but I think you need to start with where you come from and who it is that you can relate to best to get them activated, get them organized, get them militarized. And that is how we're going to impress the lumpen sector. I don't think there are any words in the whole motherfucking dictionary that's going to get somebody to stop being lumpen because they're in that position for a reason. Nobody wants to be there. They're forced there by circumstances. And unless you can materially change the circumstances that put them there, which you've admitted you don't have the capability in that specific instance, then you're not going to be able to reach them. You're going to come up against the lumpen bourgeoisie. You're going to come up against the state. The state is handing out money, hand over fist to lumpen people. Most of it gets sucked up by the lumpen proletariat. But there are like social programs out there that they can outdo you. You know, they can outgive. You'll never be able to compete with the U.S. government when it comes to handouts. And a lot of lumpen people understand that. There's a lot of them who, if they're not robbing, proletarians, they're scamming the U.S. government, and they get away with it because the U.S. government, they would rather have them on that welfare, scam than causing trouble elsewhere, being revolutionary. You know what I mean?
Yeah, if push comes to shove, like if a Maoist or any other anarcho-communist or whatever organization started getting big in the hood, like we have a saying in STL, like it ain't nothing to have you killed for $20. Like the United States government will give some heroin dealer, fentanyl dealer, $50,000 to have you and your whole cadre bumped off, and they'll do it for nothing. Like
this has precedence in Chicago. Yeah, I'm just going to throw that out there.
Like you ever seen Scarface where Tony Montana is like, I'll kill a communist for free? Like a lot of people feel like that, especially if you're down there in Florida where a lot of those Cuban reactionary exiles are. Like, yeah, like once you start, like everybody talks about organizing in the hood, et cetera, but there's already infrastructure there. You've got churches, many of which are tied to lumpen. You've got nonprofits, many of which are money laundering vehicles for lumpen, etc. So it's not like you're going to be entering uncharted territory. You're going to be bumping up against a lot of people, some of which may try to hurt you. Iotor.
I mean, I don't think I really disagreed with anything that Carlos said. Like, I just fully agree in the necessity of having an armed, like, militant core to it, and that you need to start off with like the people that you relate to and are doing. And I feel that that's basically like we've laid that groundwork down and are working through that, and that it's necessary to recruit people into it through like these kinds of community organizations. Like I don't know of anybody in like peacetime who's directly just straight up like army and nothing else. Like I'm not at all disagreeing with the necessity of like a militant part of it. I'm just saying that that's not the only thing that needs to exist. And also I agree that you'll run out of money. When we did it, we had that issue. That's why I said that as a criticism of that being an issue, and was saying what are other things we can do, and the like self-defense from feminism thing, and the like tenants union thing being two things that doesn't require any material resources that the U.S. government very much can't do because it's kind of going against their interests, and is starting to work with lumpen proletariat. But I think it's perfect.
Yeah, Iotor, those are the two things that you should really focus on. Like My position on mutual aid and that of a lot of other FTP comrades is that it's fine if if it's in coalition with other organizations. If you try to do it by yourself, you're going to be a go broke, or you're going to get some attention, and then you're going to have the U.S. government come in and be like, "Oh, thank you. Now watch Big Daddy move," and then they'll drop $200 million in the hood, and then you won't be able to get like not even one person to show up at your meetings because they're all going to the government thing. They'll come and they'll buy you up or buy you out. Carlo, then we can wrap this up.
Real quick. You know, I just got to say that not every lumpen proletarian is worthy of organizing. You know, earlier I mentioned that we got to have a dialectical view of the sex trade. If you are interested in organizing the lumpen proletariat, you got to be with the exploited. Fuck the sex buyers. Fuck the heroin dealers. I'm saying fuck the pimps. Those people need to be organized against. And I realize that in the grand scheme of things, they're like a lower level of exploiter. And they may be, you know, your neighbor. They might be close to you and easy to talk to. They might even have nice things to say. But those are the kinds of people that need to be organized against, because they're actively doing harm in the community on behalf of the bourgeoisie. They are the ones executing that ideology on the people. And I think they get too comfortable. I think the Panthers had a similar idea around drug dealers, you know, for at least in the beginning, you know, where they would pressure drug dealers to give up dealing in the neighborhoods. They changed that as they progressed. But I think that ideology still makes sense, because if you go out here to Albany Park, Northwest Chicago, and you ask the people to join a tenants union with the heroin dealer who lives in their building, hell no. They're the reason why they're scared to go outside. They're the reason why their kids don't play out the park, because these fucking, you know, these parasitic criminal elements who are just, you know, typically nihilistic, typically thuggish mentality, they're the real exploiter for these people.
That's a really good point. One of the things that we've been working on that I wrote in like a self-critique recently that like I needed to like get more intense with is like taking notes whenever a neighbor of a place is like mentions that a person is like obnoxiously frequent police showing up, or if they have a Confederate flag instead of a license plate, stuff like that. If anybody like goes out and starts working on tenants unions and things like that, I would recommend, like, as you're going through and having a list of like where people are the most, like which people are the most interested, which are the least interested, also like which people seem like they're like a threat to the community that you're in.
All right. Does anybody have any closing thoughts?
I guess what I would want to say is that because of the historical process that has led us to this point, dealing with the lumpen is kind of an inevitable necessity. It's a very under-theorized point of engagement, but it will have to be done, and we have to do it. So I think this discussion has been very valuable. I guess what I would emphasize is that any engagement with the lumpen has to be very, very deliberate and very, very well organized in advance. I think lumpen-led organizations, predominantly lumpen organizations, like that's a very dangerous situation, because you know, they don't necessarily have the sort of foundational principles that communists do. So, I mean, not that there can't be lumpen communists, but I think you get what I mean. It's easy for them to veer off into non-revolutionary trajectories. So I would just say that while it is inevitable that we will have to deal with the lumpen, I think one of the most important things will be to sort of develop the revolutionary organizational infrastructure to integrate them into first, and then beyond that, we can work on engaging with them more.
All right. Iotor, Carlo.
There's very good reason to always be like skeptical of anyone who you're working with, in the sense of like make sure that they're not, you know, a narc or a cop or somebody, or they're going to report you. It's always a good idea to sort of make sure that like I agree with everything that with Fish said, but also I think there's a lot of reason to be very hopeful when organizing with the Lumpen proletariat. I've just a lot of people who I met, like who are lumpen proletariat either at the time or still are like very active and dedicated communists. So while there's definitely a risk, there's also a very high reward.
Oh, my sweet summer child. All right. So that's that. Check us out in a couple more weeks. Glad to be back. This has been Better Read Than Dead. And I did not fuck it up this time.
Was I okay?
Hold on.